Olá, gente, tudo bem? Bom dia para todo mundo que está aqui conosco nesse evento que é a Varanda do ITS, número 139, né? Em 10 anos aí de ITS, já é a nossa varanda de número 139, e hoje uma varanda que vai falar de um assunto super importante e que, né, me é muito caro, um assunto de que eu gosto muito. Vamos falar sobre direitos autorais, e eu já vou mudar de língua porque temos uma convidada muito especial, estrangeira. Today we have here Professor Séverine Dusollier. I'll let her introduce herself, but what I can tell you is that Professor Séverine, is professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and where I happen to be a visiting researcher and visiting professor. So thank you, Professor Séverine, for receiving me here. And there is one detail before Professor Séverine introduces herself. There is one detail that is very important to share with you. A few years ago, I was writing my PhD thesis in copyright. Those of you who know me know that I made a research on public domain. This was my PhD thesis. And that was when I found a fantastic research by Professor Séverine that was probably the most important source of my thesis. So I wouldn't have a thesis without her work, and that's why I'm so grateful for her for all those years. After that, I happened to meet her in person, and then that's it. We are here, and I want to thank her again for her generosity in sharing her knowledge, her experience about the European copyright directive, and that's the reason why we are here to listen to her. So, Professor Séverine, thank you so much for being here with us, and I would like you to introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours to talk about the directive, the European Directive on Copyright.
Thank you very much. This is really a nice introduction. I don't know how to introduce myself in addition to what you just said. So yes, I'm a professor in Paris. I'm also, of course, I'm following the European Union regulation in copyright from the very beginning, and I've been also a founding member of the European Copyright Society, which is a sort of network of a few copyright academics in the European Union, and we try to just voice our concern or give advice or give recommendation to the EU institution about how to deal with copyright issues. Yeah, I think that's all. And I'm really happy to have Sergio with us in Paris. So the thanks are reciprocal, I think.
Well, again, thank you for being here. Just let me tell our audience what it's all about. Well, Brazil has been discussing changes in the copyright law for 15 years. So these discussions started in 2007, around 2007. We were supposed to make changes in our copyright law around 2010, but it didn't happen. At the same time, we were discussing a law, and it became a law, to regulate the Brazilian internet, what we call Marco Civil, the civil framework for Brazilian internet. And Marco Civil, that is our main law to regulate internet, doesn't talk about copyright, because at the same time, both laws were being discussed in the Congress, and people said, well, if we cannot agree on the liability of intermediaries concerning copyright for Marco Civil, and the copyright law is being discussed in the Congress, let's leave it to the copyright law. But Marco Civil was approved, saying, well, this law does not talk about copyright because it depends on the regulation of copyright. So let's leave it to the copyright law. But the copyright law was never amended, so we don't have a solution for that. And since then, Marco Civil was discussed between 2009, 2011, but it was approved in Congress only in 2014, so 10 years ago. But in the last 15 years, we've been discussing, okay, what to do with our copyright law if we don't have the intermediary liability regulated there. After that, we saw the rise in discussion of privacy, data protection, and fake news, content moderation, and now artificial intelligence. All the problems pile up, and we don't solve the copyright problems. And now again, after 15 years, we see new proposals of law to regulate the liability of intermediaries concerning copyright. But now the law talks about music and audiovisual works and how this content should generate remuneration for artists. So it's more like this. But many people who are in the public debate now about copyright on internet, they were not debating that 15 years ago, because 15 years is a long time. So many people discussing internet regulation now, who is 25 years old or 35 years old, they were not discussing this 15 years ago. That's why ITS decided to make a series of events and record a series of videos that we call, in Portuguese, Museu de Novas Ideias, the Museum of New Ideas in copyright. So we can go back and say, well, okay, let's talk about copyright regulation in the last 20 years. And let's discuss what happened, what was improved, what was not, what we could solve. For example, collective management was something that was improved in Brazil in a new law from 2013, but now it lacks a regulation on liability of intermediaries. So we followed in Brazil all the debate concerning the new European directive. That includes two things that in Brazil are very relevant: the remuneration for journalistic material, that's Article 15 in the directive, and the liability of intermediaries, Article 17. So that's the making of this event. So why I invited Professor Séverine to be with us, because she's a specialist on the directive. She has written and published a work. I highly recommend you. It's online, free access, examining all the articles of the directive in a very comprehensive way. So if you're interested on the topic, it's easy to find. It's on her profile at Sciences Po. You can see her publications there. And it's not very extensive. It's like 60 pages. For the analysis of a whole directive, it's wonderful, because we can have a very good, concise, but profound view from all the entire directive. But today, we will concentrate on the responsibility, the liability of intermediaries that is regulated on Article 17. So that's more or less an introduction, so people can understand what's the core, the heart of this. So, Professor Séverine, now it's with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I have prepared a short PowerPoint just to explain the context of the directive, and then I will focus on Article 17, but I might also review the whole directive very quickly with you. And in yeah, let me just clear it. In reaction to the introduction by Sergio, and also the historical evolution, or non-evolution, I could say, in Brazil, I think I have prepared also some historical evolution to try to to contextualize the adoption of this directive in 2019 on copyright in the digital single market, because it can also show you what is very specific about that directive and what place it takes in the different legislative activities of the European Union in the field of copyright. So, oops. It doesn't work. Yes, it works. So actually, do you see my screen? It's not a problem, everyone?
I see your screen, yes.
Okay, perfect. So actually, but I cannot see it when I'm talking to you. So let me just rearrange. Okay. So actually, what is important is just to remember that this directive of 2019 is the second big directive in copyright. So in the European Union, we have around 12, 13, 14, I don't remember exactly, directive in the field of copyright and a few regulation too. And those directives, most of the time, they are focusing on a very specific issue, and they're trying to harmonize the legislation of the 27 member states. So this is the key point that maybe make it a bit different from national regulation or national legislation like in Brazil, because the key purpose is also to try to harmonize the national legislation. So it is a different objective than what a national lawmaker would pursue. And actually, we have two directives that are really major, or they are addressing several issues and trying to just address the regime of copyright at a very specific technological moment. This is the 2001 directive on copyright in the information society. And then now we have the 2019, oh, I don't know why it doesn't work. Okay, the 2019 directive. So just to show you how we have evolved from the 2001 directive to today, at the time of the 2001 directive, the internet was just beginning, and this directive was also following international discussion about copyright that led to the adoption of the WIPO copyright treaty, and it was also aligned to similar discussion at the US that led to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And at the time, the key concern was piracy, the fact that the internet was a threat to copyright. So there was really the fear that copyright was not strong enough to resist the ease of copy that was induced by the internet. So at the time, most of the attention was about strengthening the copyright for the right holders and trying to make it stronger by using technological measures of protection, by reducing copyright exception, etc. So it was really a defensive reaction, I would say. But that didn't yield a lot of public support. And in Europe, it was really, really important to witness also that people were demonstrating in the street against such copyright reinforcement, which was a bit crazy, but we had political parties that were set up only on the issue of copyright, the Pirate Party that won a few seats at the European Parliament. So that was maybe a different period, but it was really, I think it still informed what happened almost 20 years afterward. So when the 2019 directive started to be discussed in 2014, 15, there was a need, of course, to look back at the directive of 2001 to see what was working or not, maybe to revise it. But also there was a time where finally internet was not only a threat, it was an opportunity. And a lot of digital services have emerged, and they wanted to have a copyright that worked for them, so that could achieve digital market enhancement. So you had a lot of different services in music, in film, etc., in books, in whatever you can imagine. And so this is a completely change of perspective, I think. you have to remember that when the 2001 directive was discussed, it started in 1997, was WIPO discussion. At the time, we didn't have, so the DVD was just invented. Napster emerged at that time, Wikipedia emerged, but we didn't have iTunes, we didn't have, a lot of things that seem to have been born with the internet were not there anymore. We're not there yet. And so if you look at the time of the discussion of the directive, the 2001, we were really at the very beginning of what the internet would become. And of course, if you move forward and you go to 2015, where we started to discuss, then we had a lot of emerging digital actors that were starting to take benefit from the digital market. So the point was completely different then. And so the directive of 2001 was in a context with Web 1.0, where internet was mostly an information portal. You went on the internet to look for information, but you couldn't do a lot of things yourself as an individual. You could post things on the internet, but you couldn't really interact with the content that was posted. You couldn't download a lot of things because you needed to have a huge bandwidth, and most of the people didn't have that. So, it was completely different time. So at the time, the 2001 directive just quickly started to adapt some copyright, adapt the existing copyright by strengthening exclusive right, by meeting some limited exception, and trying to harmonize a bit. But mostly it was about securing the interests of the creative industry that were the only one whose voice were heard at the time. In 2015, when we start thinking forward, we realized at EU that there was still a lot of things that were not harmonized despite that first attempt, that at the time it was still 28 countries, but these 28 countries had very different systems of copyright exceptions, for instance. And so the copyright was still territorial. So it means that for those new digital service coming, you need to get copyright clearance for the 27th country. So it was really, really difficult. The exceptions were increasingly seen as valuable uses, exception for education, for libraries. So they were not only threat and limitation to copyright, they were also tools to develop services for the public good. So they were completely a change of scenario. There was piracy, but it was also at the time where we look again at copyright legislation, it was declining because of the emergence of legitimate services. So the focus was not so much about piracy. And then there was still there was a new concern that was the fact that, okay, but there is this amazing digital environment where a lot of new business model emerge, provide services, make money. But actually, how are creators and performers making money? Are they fairly treated? Are they fairly remunerated? So there were a lot of also concern about the protection of creators and performers and artists. And the case of YouTube that led to the Article 17 was really important, and I will come to that in a moment. So actually, when we talk about the 2019 directive on copyright in the digital single market, we should not forget that it was part of what we called the EU copyright reform package. And it was it was constituted by several directives and regulations that started to really reform copyright at the EU level to address different type of issues concerned by the digital development and by the development of the internet. So I listed them here, but of course the only one I will really discuss is the 2019 directive on copyright in the digital single market. But if you have questions on others, we could come back to it. So actually this directive have three objectives that are also appearing in the preamble. So the preamble says at some point, new uses have emerged, as well as new actors and new business model. In the digital environment, cross-border use have also intensified new opportunities for consumers to access copyright-protected content at materialize. So you see immediately that the point is on the market and about achieving this digital market for the benefit of the service providers, consumers, and copyright owners. And there are three key objectives, specific objective in that directive. The first one is to ensure that people, consumers, individuals have access to content online, that they don't want to go to piracy website because they will have what they are looking for in legitimate services. The second objective was to adapt exceptions to digital and cross-border environments, and not look at suspicion to copyright exception, but trying to make them emerge as tools for also developing a real digital society. And the last objective is the achievement of a well-functioning and fair marketplace for copyright owners. And actually, the point was really to add a piece. So this directive would be the missing piece, if you wish, of the copyright acquis that is constituted by all the directives that we have already in the European Union. Actually, that was the intention, but you see that the piece is not taking its proper place yet, and I don't think that it was completely achieved, and that I don't think that the puzzle is over. Okay, so if I will say a very quick word on each objective and just point out at the provisions that appear in the directive, but then I will develop a bit more the Article 17. So as far as wider access to content is concerned, actually this copyright reform is so this objective is pursued by different pieces of legislation. The Collective Management Directive, they try to achieve some pan-European licensing so that cross-border services can have one contact point to get copyright clearance. You have also regulation on portability that try to answer the issue that you have a subscription to Spotify or Netflix, and you live in you live in Paris, for instance, and you have this subscription, but as soon as you're traveling for a conference in Germany or for holiday in Italy, you cannot access your subscription. And so that regulation has tackled that issue. And you have the directive on online transmission and broadcasting that is about the fact that there are websites of broadcasters, public broadcasters or private broadcasters that cannot offer the content online throughout Europe, but are limited to their own country. And this directive is also addressing that issue imperfectly, but to some extent. The second objective I said was to achieve better exceptions. So my analysis here, but it's not shared by everybody, but I think that the directive makes a first step in the direction of not seeing copyright exception, as limitation that you have to limit, that you have to keep an eye on, but trying to transform some exception into enabling devices. So devices to permit better education, cross-border education in Europe, to give means to libraries to digitize their collection and to do their job as librarians. So I think that the directive is a step forward. It's not enough, but it's already there. So there is one, actually those exceptions are mandatory, most of them. There is the text and data mining exception, the Article 3 and 4 for scientific research and for other purposes. And that other purpose actually included generative AI that was not considered at all during the discussion about the directive. And that raises a major issue today. You have the digital uses for teaching in Article 5, because there was still a very fragmented situation in the EU, which was difficult when you wanted to develop teaching in a cross-border basis. Cultural heritage institutions have a better exception for preservation. So all those exceptions except Article 4 are mandatory. They cannot be contracted out. You have also a system for art of commerce works, also benefiting the cultural heritage institution. And then you have directive and regulation of visually impaired people exception that comes from the Marrakesh Treaty. The last objective, and this is the one I will focus on, is to achieve a fair and functioning digital market. So here you have 3 parts, and each of them is addressing some injustice, I would say, or something that seems unfair. The first one is the enactment of a new right for press publishers against search engine mostly. It's not a copyright, it's a related right, neighboring right, that cover only online uses of press publications, so press articles, and that has a very limited duration of 2 years after publication. We can come back to it during the question and answer. The case of content sharing platform that I will develop. And then a part that is really, really important to me, and very also that was really, really radical, I think, is a few articles dealing with remuneration and contractual protection of authors and performers, with the right to proportionate remuneration, an obligation for transparency, a contract adjustment mechanism, and even a right to revoke the contract if the work is not exploited. So all that was added almost at the last minute by members of the European Parliament, and it was really fought against by publishers and producers, you know, so that was an interesting also context. Okay, so let's focus on Article 17. So first, the background, Article 17. So the Article 17 is really is dealing with YouTube and other type of services that share volume of copyrighted works that are uploaded by users. But YouTube is the typical case, of course, and I will use it as an example. So the legal background. So why was it needed to address those type of digital service providers? There was the liability exemption that existed in the Directive of E-commerce, so the one that you don't have in Brazil, that comes also from the US, that actually exempt from liability providers of hosting services. So those that exemption does not appear, so not anymore in the Directive of E-commerce, but it's a Digital Service Act that has replaced the provisions of the e-commerce directive, just that you know. So YouTube was considered as actually hosting videos that were uploaded by its users. So it was not liable if those videos contain copyrighted material. It was only obliged to answer to injunctions and to notice and take down from copyright owners, and then it had to remove that content from YouTube. But at the same time, YouTube made a lot of money because, or Google made a lot of money because YouTube was monetizing that content, putting publicity, advertising, you know, and also organizing. YouTube has a system where you are constantly taken to new videos, you know, so you are exposed to a lot of advertisement, publicity, etc. The Court of Justice in 2021, it was after the directive, but it was still on a case dated from before the directive, said that YouTube itself didn't make any act of making available, that it was only the users who did that. So actually the copyright owners, they were a bit stuck because they couldn't ask YouTube to to pay for the use of the copyright material, and they could only use the possibility of injunction and notice and takedown. So they really pushed forward a new solution, and they were relying a lot on the economic background of that situation. The fact that, as I said, YouTube is making money a lot, on all this copyrighted content. That also studies showed that YouTube was actually the first source for music in the EU. So most of the people, before going to Deezer, Spotify, etc., they were going to YouTube to listen to music. So, and then there was also the fact that YouTube actually compete with other digital audiovisual services. I put audiovisual services, this is a mistake, with other internet services, like, some economists calculated, but it's not very clear because we don't have access to all data, but the Google contribution to copyright owners based on licenses and monetization was only about 10% of revenues, but other streaming services like Deezer and Spotify give 70% of their revenues to copyright owners. So, it is in competition with the legitimate services too, and this is what mostly the music industry called the value gap. The gap of value between the value that was produced in the music industry by the music industry and the return from Google, but also the value gap between services that need to ask for license and pay the price for those licenses, and Google that make money without needing any licenses, but legitimately, because it was considered legitimate by copyright law. So actually, the European Commission accepted the argument of the value gap, and so put forward this Article 17 that was fiercely contested and challenged during the years of discussion of the directive. To give you just one anecdote, during the discussion, it was the Article 13. And actually, I remember I have a friend who is a member of the European Parliament in Brussels. And actually, at the time, her son was, I don't know, I think he was nine years old, something like that. And one day, he told her, "Mom, will you vote against Article 13? Please vote against Article 13 because it's evil." And he had no clue about what it was going on, but because he was on YouTube and he was exposed to all those campaigns by digital service providers, for him it was the most crucial issue of the world. And it was really, really, really fun, of course. And so it showed that it was really an important issue. So what does this article say? It covers online content sharing service provider, what we have started to call OCSSP, which is a nightmare to remember. But so those are the provider of an information society services whose main, or one of the main purposes, is to store and give the public access to a large amount of works or other subject matter uploaded by its user, which it organizes and promotes for profit-making purposes. So I think you have three elements here. The fact that it gives access to a large amount of work to the public. It is uploaded by its users, so it's not the services that select the content it wants to give access to, like Deezer, like Netflix, for instance. And also it organizes and promotes it for profit-making purposes. So this is the element that makes it a bit different from regular hosting services. It hosts it, for sure, but at the same time, it organizes it and it wants to make profit out of it. So it's a bit different from regular hosting services. There are some exclusion in the directive, online encyclopedia, etc. So actually it covers YouTube. I'm sorry, I might have put some services that are not known in Brazil, but YouTube for sure, TikTok, maybe not Vimeo and Dailymotion, I don't know.
We do. We know all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. It could cover Facebook, but it's not clear whether, Facebook organizes this amount of works. It is a large amount of work. So it's not completely clear if Facebook is is covered, but Facebook has started to negotiate with copyright owners. What is not covered is, cloud services, platform like eBay or Wikipedia, for instance. Okay. The systems that it put in place is the following. So actually, it's a twofold system, and it is important because most people only remind the filtering system, but it's only a part of the regime. So the first part of the regime is that the directive says those OCSSSP, they are doing a communication to the public. So because they are communicate works to the public, they have to get a license from copyright owners, like any other act covered by an exclusive right under copyright. What is interesting is that actually YouTube or Google is set to be the one communicating to the public, and the obligation that to get a license, or the license it will get, will actually cover the upload by user to the extent that they act for non-commercial purposes. So it means that the users themselves, we know that they are the ones making available the content, but they will be covered, so their activities will be covered by the license that has been cleared by the service provider. And this is an important element, I think. So the first part is licensing. If you don't have a license, and you might not have a license because you cannot find the right holders, because the right holders doesn't want to give you a license, it's still an exclusive right. So the producer of a film, for instance, would not agree that the film, it would be on YouTube. So it might say, no, I don't want that it is on YouTube. So if you don't have a license, you are liable for copyright infringement, except if, and it is cumulative, you made best efforts to obtain authorization, you made best efforts to ensure the unavailability of specific works upon request of right holders, and you acted expeditiously upon receiving a sufficiently notice from the right holders to disable access to and to remove the notified works and prevent the future uploads. So this part, the last two parts, sorry, I went too quickly, is actually the filtering that we've been talking about. So the fact that, and it aligns on the system of notice and takedown that existed before, but it's different because the notice and takedown comes ex post in a way. And here you have a mix of ex post and ex ante. So the right holder can say, those works, we don't want to see them on your platform. So you have to avoid the uploading from the very beginning. And once you have removed them, and this is the last part, you need to prevent that they are put back again, So it's a bit further or more efforts than notice and takedown. And that was what was the mostly contested part of the system, because a lot of people said, oh, it's a harm to freedom of expression, the users will never be able to post anything on YouTube, etc., etc. The YouTuber that are creators of their own kind, they will never be able to put things on YouTube again because they won't be they won't be allowed to put music, etc., etc. The directive is now in force for a few years. It hasn't happened so much. A lot of copyright owners have actually are actually giving license to those service providers, and I think that the situation is going all right. We don't have a lot of empirical studies yet, but I think that we don't see. Some people said it's the end of the internet as we know it. I don't think. I'm still using the internet as I used to a few years ago. I was myself a bit critical of that regime, but and I'm still are for a few reasons. But I think that at least it was not as, or at least it was not as it was predicted.
Séverine,
Yes?
if I may, just a very short question that has to do with this specific point. I think you make reference to this in your article that I mentioned in the beginning of our meeting, but don't you think it's a little weird that YouTube, for example, has an obligation to get a license before the user upload something? Because how is YouTube or any platform, how are the platforms going to know what license to obtain if it's the user who publishes the content? So it's kind of contradictory, don't you think?
Yeah, actually, this is the main point of criticism, because the issue is that if you are Netflix, for instance, if you are Netflix, you're not an hosting provider. You decide what you put in your catalog, and so you enter into licensing with some producers of movies, of series, and you put them in your catalog. So you know exactly what you want to appear. The same is true for Spotify or Deezer, even though, they will have some sort of big licensing with collective management organization that will cover vast repertoire. So they might not know exactly what they are offering, but still they need to have those recordings on their servers in any case. So the issue with YouTube or services like that is that actually they are not the ones selecting the content that is uploaded. Those are the users. So in a way, it's asking them to, as you perfectly pointed out, it's asking them to try to have all the works in the world in the possibility that that work could be uploaded. Actually, the way it's and yes, and so some critique was that YouTube will transform into an edited service, into a service where that will be impoverished because the YouTube will only select things for which it's sure that it has some license. Actually, it doesn't happen like that. But it not for a legal reason, because I agree with you that in theory, this is unfair and this is completely impossible to achieve. But pragmatically, I think that Google, but again, this is a big operator. So it's change also is force of negotiation. But pragmatically, it's true that the collective management organization, like in music, for instance, they are ready to license the whole repertoire, actually.
Yeah, it's true, of course.
And also what happens, despite the fact that the first point is that you have to make best efforts to obtain authorization. So is it sufficient that Google say, we are ready to negotiate, please come and negotiate with us? Some people say, no, it's not enough. You need to be proactive. But if you need to be proactive, you need to identify all the possible copyright owners in the world, which is impossible. So I think that pragmatically, and we don't have any case yet, but I think that pragmatically, all people agree that, YouTube, Google say, or other service says, we want to negotiate with you, so come. And if they don't come, then they are not liable because they made the effort, and the right holders don't disagree. So, in a way, this is the status quo. But I agree with you that at the core of it, there is a contradiction. That is not fair to ask YouTube to get the authorization for an activity that it will never carry out itself. So I think it's completely a bit crazy. And another solution would have been to put some compulsory licensing, so some compensation, a right to remuneration, meaning that those services would not ask for permission, but they would pay. But here, for instance, I know that Hollywood industry objected because they said, we don't want our movies to be on YouTube. So we don't want to be paid because we don't want the movie to be available in the first place, which makes sense. You don't want to have your movie on YouTube, available on YouTube if it has been released 2 days before in public theaters. Okay, so the other criticism is the role that is still given to freedom of expression of copyright exception. And, that was a case, there was a lot of cases around the world, but one case that was really, really, that was a lot talked about was in the US, where you had a young mom that put a video on YouTube of her baby that was dancing on the music of Prince. And because the music of Prince was tagged by Content ID, the system put in place by Google to identify content that the right holders want to get removed from the platform, it was blocked. And so that woman just went before courts to say, I don't agree. This is a fair use. This is, this is not under copyright. And I want to show how my baby is beautiful and funny when he's dancing on Prince. And she didn't win, whatever, but this is a typical case. There are a lot of things that you put on YouTube that is just, covered by freedom of expression or covered by exception. It could be a parody. It could be that you are putting, a video of your wedding and you have music in the background. And then because the music will be identified by Google as not authorized, then you will not be able to share to the world your happiness at the wedding. So, it's a lot of, this is a balance to be achieved here that is not easy. And of course, that was one of the hottest points of the discussion. So actually what the Article 17 put place is a series of things that try to achieve some balance. The first one is Article 17.7 that says that those OCSSP and right holders will have to cooperate in order not to prevent the availability of legitimate content. What does it mean? I don't know, but I have to do something to avoid that freedom of expression and legitimate content cannot be available online. And it says also that users can rely on quotation, criticism, review, and parody. So it is sort of, the way I see it, ex ante consideration. So they have to put in place systems that do not impinge the uploading of legitimate content. But then you have also the ex post consideration. So if some content is removed, the OCSP needs to put in place a complaint and redress mechanisms for the users to complain and to say, I don't agree, it's parody, it's fair use, it's, whatever, the music is not protected by copyright, etc. And this system should be efficient, and it could lead to judicial litigation if the users want, and it should be some human in the process. I don't think there are a lot of studies about the fact that users are resorting to those mechanisms. Actually, they don't. So, I still think that the system might not be working. There are also a lot of differences in the way the different member states have implemented that. We can come back to it in the question and answers. And so there is still another provision that says that this system should not affect legitimate uses, but this is just a empty statement, because it will. For sure, it will affect legitimate uses. That there is no way that it won't. Yes, and then, so one country, Poland, had challenged that provision before the Court of Justice by saying that it was against freedom of expression. The Court of Justice 2 years ago already said that no, it's perfectly fine. There was a lot of safeguards in that article, and it's completely compatible with freedom of expression. Okay. So that is actually the system in a nutshell. And of course, what is now at the center of the discussion at the European Union is generative AI. And here we have the feeling that we have missed an opportunity in the 2019 copyright directive, but it's not what you wanted me to talk about. So I will stop here. So we have time for discussion.
Oh, okay. In fact,
yeah, it was too
Séverine,
short. You want me to continue?
No. In fact, now that you mention generative AI, if you want to say a few words why you think you missed this opportunity, because you mentioned when you talked about articles 3 and 4, that are those about data mining. I know the first one, the Article 3, if I'm not mistaken, is not it does not go in the direction of AI, generative AI or artificial intelligence, but Article 4 might have a connection with artificial intelligence. So considering that the directive was approved, passed in 2019, before generative AI was in fashion, and now we have generative AI, and we have the discussion of AI Act in Europe, but the directive is about copyright. So how can we connect the things? We go back to Article 17 in a few minutes, but how can we connect what's the solution now when we talk about generative AI and copyright in Europe? Can we use the directive, the 2019 directive? Should we use AI Act, or should we try to pass a new law because neither the directive or the AI Act is good enough to deal with generative AI? What's your impression?
Okay, so actually, just to tell a few words about the system now in Europe for that, for the people who don't know. So it's true that you have this exception for text and data mining in the copyright directive. At the beginning, it was only for scientific research, you know, and the consensus was that scientific research should be allowed to mine a lot of information to try to extract, you know, conclusion, etc. But then during the discussion of the directive, some people said, but you know, there is also AI that is coming that will be huge. And we need also to allow AI to do text and data mining, because and if the data are copyrighted, and there might be a lot of copyrighted material in the data, we don't mind, because the whole point is just to extract information, but not exploiting the expressive value of the work or whatever. So everybody agreed. But it was without generative AI at the point, you know, and so we knew our AI was working, but we didn't think that AI would create or reproduce works, you know, and might substitute to creation. So in the last year, of course, everybody started to panic to say that, oh my God, we have allowed generative AI under an exception. And the only way out is in the Article 4 that allows for text and data mining for any kind of purposes. The only way out is for the copyright owners to say, I don't want to. And so to opt out of the system, to express that their reservation about the use of their works to that point. But getting out is very complicated. Opting out is very complicated. We don't know how to do it. We know already that the works have been integrated in the data set that are used for training purposes of the generative AI models, etc. And there was still some doubt whether it could apply to generative AI, because the exception was not sought with generative in mind. So we could say, okay, but we have to apply a narrow interpretation of the exception. But actually the AI Act that you are mentioning, so this is a regulation of AI system by the European Union that is, you know, that will be finalized in the next days or weeks. That AI Act actually confirmed that the text and data mining exception in the copyright directive applies to generative AI. And it's just asked to the providers of generative AI model to put in place a policy to deal with these opt-out systems and to give some information about what is in the data sets. So actually it tries to put in place the means for the copyright owners to be able to exercise their opt-out, but there are still a lot of questions. And most copyright owners in the EU, they just want to revise the 2019 directive on that point. They want to reopen the debate, either to revise the directive or to enact a new legislation on generative AI. My opinion is that the fact that they also wanted to make the issue into the AI Act was actually, you know, a bad strategy, because now I think the debate is closed, at least for a few years.
So if the debate is closed for a few years, the rule would be data mining is allowed for generative AI, the exception being an opt-out system. If the artist, the copyright owner doesn't want his or her work to be used in data mining, they will have to opt out, but it's still unknown the way this opt-out option will be offered for artists. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay, yeah, very challenging, very challenging. So, okay, wonderful. I think it's very clear the connection with generative AI and copyright. Let me go back to Article 17, and you said in Brazil we discussed a lot. Oh, exactly what you mentioned. This is the end of the internet as we know it. It will never be the same anymore. And this was the discourse that we heard in Brazil while the directive was being debated in Europe. And you said, well, things remain more or less the same. Do you know any judicial, any court challenge, apart from Poland saying, well, Article 17 is not compatible with freedom of expression, but is there any relevant case regarding Article 17 in Europe that you are aware of, saying this specific case, in this specific case, Article 17 represented a threat to my freedom of expression, or Google or any other platform was sued because they couldn't get the license or the best efforts or the filter or whatever. In short, has the Article 17 been challenged, apart from Poland, in any way so far that we can learn from what happened?
No, not that I know of. Okay. I don't think that there were any litigation. I think that the market just adjusted, you know. But what I assume is that you have big copyright owners that started licensing, so collective management like organizations that are really important in Europe and well organized. They started to negotiate with Google and with Facebook, with a lot of other actors, TikTok, etc. And yeah, there were no real challenge, I think, because, and I don't know, and I'm sure that there are a lot of researchers working on that at the moment, but the point that would be interested is to know how much the complaint system has been used by users whose content has been removed from platforms, you know, and whether the fact that the system is more organized than it used to be has actually increased significantly the number of removals by the users. And if it hasn't, whether it signifies that they don't care, they don't have the means, they don't have the time to complain, or whether actually there are not a lot of legitimate content that has been removed, which I would doubt, of course.
Yeah, me too.
So, you know, no, I don't think that the question is also that, and let me go to my next slide, but, you know, the system that has been put in place, the fact that the system or the platforms and the right holder should be everything they can to avoid that legitimate content is not uploaded on the platform. Actually, the countries have put in place systems in very different ways to address that issue. For instance, in France, and those are the big, and this is not at all considered, even though that directive was aimed at harmonizing the regime. Actually, the regime is rather fragmented. So you have countries like France and countries like Germany, they have put in place very different systems. So the country like France consider that, so the implementation, the national legislation, consider that if you have a copy of a work that is protected in the content that you upload, that it's enough to say it's illegitimate. And the claim of getting, you know, that you make a parody, a quotation, that, you know, it's a minor use or whatever, is on the user that can react ex post. In Germany, they've put a system in place where they put a lot of efforts before upload to check whether it's really infringement. the first thing is that it's only when there is a complete identity between the work and the content that is uploaded on YouTube that the system can block it, you know. So it's not so if, for instance, if there are some, you know, a few seconds that are the same, it's not enough. It really need to be a complete similarity. And then there will be also some trusted person that could, so no, this, yeah, the users can flag their upload saying, I'm putting that on YouTube and I know this is a parody and I signal to YouTube that is a parody, you know. And in that case, YouTube is obliged to put it online, and then it's the right holders who can complain saying, come on, it's not a parody, it's blatant infringement, you know. So actually the system is completely the reverse. And I'm completely puzzled that it could happen like that, because the system should be harmonized, but it seems to work fine, and nobody complained that actually you didn't have the same freedom of upload in France compared to Germany. So at some point, there might be some litigation that will come before the Court of Justice. I don't know.
But well, so far it's good news that there's not been a lot of litigation and challenges of the directive before the courts, because as both of us mentioned, the discourse by the time of the discussion was, oh, it will be terrible for freedom of expression, but it seems that things have worked well so far concerning the application of Article 17, it seems to me, right?
Yeah, but you have heard also about the TikTok case and the fact that suddenly music disappeared on TikTok. So it's not completely related to Article 17. It's more about the situation between license, you know, between the music industry and one of the major in the music industry and TikTok about the licensing condition. And I know that there were fears also about generative AI. So it's a complex situation and we don't know everything that happened. But I think this was worrying that, you know, one day you didn't have any videos with music from that copyright owners on YouTube. So, you know, I think that shows that things could go wrong if at some point, you know, the licensing process doesn't work.
Perfect. Well, Séverine, we are reaching the end of our meeting. Time flies when the conversation is good. I have only one last question for you. If you could, if possible, if you could say two things about the directive that said, well, that you could say, well, these two things are good ideas, this was an improvement to our copyright system, and not that Brazil should copy, but Brazil should look at these two things that are good, that were good, and you should debate the possibility not to copy, but to understand what worked in Europe, two innovations from the directive. Would you know two things to say? Do you think there are two good things about the directive?
That you could copy. So the directive, not the Article 17, right?
Yeah, in the directive or in the Article 17. If there are two good things in Article 17, okay. If not, it could be the directive.
Okay, so I think the most interesting thing in the directive is the provision for authors in terms of remuneration and contractual protection. This is really the important part. Of course, there were a lot of national provisions about that. A few countries had, but not all countries. So the point of the directive is to oblige some minimal protection for creators and performers. And this is really good. And particularly when you see how much the publishers and producers, you know, fought against that, which was a bit of a paradox, because to defend the system of Article 17, they constantly said, oh, we are there for the creators to get paid, for the artists to get paid, etc. And when it was about them paying the creators and artists, they said, oh, we cannot do that. So, you know, it was also a really paradox about the position of the copyright industry, I think. But this is a good thing. The other thing, so Article 17, I don't like it personally. But I think my point was a bit, so the copyright scholarship in Europe was really divided. You had people thinking we need to have that, it's really important. YouTube is communicating works to the public. And there were people who said, no way, freedom of expression, YouTube is not doing anything, etc. I and others, of course, were in the middle. I think that if we look at the core of copyright is about giving a right on the exploitation of creation. And I don't care how you phrase that, technically speaking or legally speaking, but at the core, I think that what Google did with YouTube is really exploiting the value of copyrighted work. So I think that it was important that YouTube compensated in some way or other the copyright holders. But I disagree the way it was done. I think that your first question was completely right. I think that it would be better if there was an obligation to remunerate, accepted an obligation to license, even though it might be complicated for some types of work. So I think that Article 17 wanted to address a real issue, but did it in a way that was not completely perfect, I think.
Okay, wonderful. I think we can look at the European experience and see what were the improvements, because the discussion in Brazil has some connections and some points of connection with Europe, and because the directive is 5 years old, it's important to understand what were the consequences of the directive, because some of those points are also being discussed in Brazil. So if we understand better, and that's why I thank you so much for your brilliant speech today, presentation, because it's not only very interesting to know, but it's also inspiring to understand what is happening in Europe in terms of regulation of copyright, because in a globalized world, the discussion is never very different. When we talk about platforms and Facebook and YouTube, the dilemmas are very similar. So because your experience dates 5 years old now, it's very, very relevant for us to hear you, to understand your concerns and your experience. And I know everybody's here on YouTube thanking you and saying this was a fantastic presentation. We don't have further questions, but
May
please.
I just add something very quickly, because you said
Of
it's 5 years. Remember that you still have a process of implementation. So it took
in each
a lot
country.
of time for member states to implement, and you still have 1 or 2 who haven't implemented. So it means that there were a lot of countries implemented only last year. So it might explain the lack of litigation, because actually the principle of the directive are enforced in countries later than 2019. The only provision that have actually led to a few litigation all over Europe, or in most countries of Europe, is Article 15 that we have not mentioned. That is the worst provision of the directive. That is the right to press publishers. And that has led to a lot of litigation. So, which I actually confirmed that it was a bad provision.
And this is one of the things that we are discussing in Brazil also. It's the remuneration for press publications. So we might need to schedule a second meeting with Séverine Dusollier to understand what went wrong with press publications in Europe. But so far, I would like to thank you very much, Séverine, once again, for your time, your generosity, your super knowledge on the issue. It's always a pleasure to meet you, even if it's online. It's a pleasure in person. It's a pleasure online. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank everybody who participated, and Renata and all the organizers from ITS and our partners. And Séverine, I'll leave you to finish the presentation with your words.
Thank you. I don't know how to finish. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope you don't put music on this, because otherwise it will be blocked on YouTube immediately.
We won't, we promise we won't.
Okay.
So thank you again, Séverine. Thanks for everybody, and see you again on Varanda number 140 very soon. Bye-bye, people. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.